Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the 1985 film House. So, a lot of people may have never heard of this in their life. Some people may not even realize that this movie had a franchise tied to it. Really, the first one is pretty good, but everything after that kind of gets a little weird, gets a little, wonky, and it almost doesn't, stay to be similar to its original film. Going into this original film, though, I kind of like how they approach this movie. How, they go into that old, there's quite a few times where there's, this old kind of story where you have a guy that is to go into seclusion to try and write his next screenplay or his next story or his next whatever. And so he just kind of hunkers down into one place, and all of a sudden, coincidentally, in this movie, that place ends up being haunted. And so, in this movie, we have a guy named Roger Cobb who is to eventually be a novelist who's thinking that he needs to go into a autobiography thing of his past in Vietnam. And all of a sudden, while he is to start remembering his past in Vietnam, all of a sudden this house is starting to remind him of horrible things that had happened to him in his life. And so Roger is to try and get a handle of what is to go on to this house. Also try to have proof that something odd is going on in this house. Eventually trying to pull his neighbor in to try to help him have proof of the craziness that is to go on in this house, because some people might start thinking that really just Roger has lost his mind, but that's not really the truth here. But yeah, I really do enjoy this film. It has a really good concept. I honestly wish that this movie would have actually been redone, remade in more current time, because I think they could have really had fun with this movie, going back at it again and just having more fun with this film. And but anyways, it does have a really good original. There's some goofy things about this that kind of have that kind of Omen kind of feel, where it's Damien, this one's for you, and it's ugh, I don't like that scene in this movie, but everything else is just kind of interesting. But anyways, so going on in this movie, so teeing it up, so novelist who decides to go into a haunted house, and eventually the house is to forcibly build up Roger's confidence, to have the confidence to be able to really just go back into his life, to write his to finish his novel, to quite possibly get his son back, and quite possibly get back in his relationship with his wife some way or another. But really, there isn't a good, happy, solid, happy ending to this movie. It just kind of ends. And I'm just man, that kind of sucks. I wish that there would have been a obviously good, solid ending. But then again, I might have to go into checking out the sequel movies just to see if, because I don't remember whether or not that the sequels cover the previous movie. I just don't remember. So it could or could not have. I'm not 100% sure. But anyways, so I really just enjoy I think the very beginning of this may or may not win people over. But eventually, once going further on into this movie, if you're not sold into the early pieces of this film, then maybe this movie may not be for you. A lot of people might have seen enough haunted house movies, but I like the approach of this film. It also has that kind of midnight madness kind of thing that goes into this movie. But other than that, yeah, like I think that's all that I wanted to just go out of my way to say about this movie in a tee up like fashion. So I think it's time for us to go into a different kind of fashion of going into this movie, which is the coveted double five time territory, because I think it is about time to say that it is spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we do spoil this movie. I know a lot of people may or may not like old films. Some people may just like, no, I would rather like him to cover new release films because I don't like to see any of these 80s or 90s or whichever films. Some people might just find what is it called? Like a treasure in the rough or a diamond in the rough that they didn't realize existed. And they're like, oh my God, I actually did like and enjoy this movie. Thank God that I went into here and randomly watched this review. But a lot of times, a lot of people are just like, nah, I didn't care for this film. Why did he even review it? Nah, that's okay. Because at the end of the day, I had fun watching a film. And I think people forget that, where it's just like, well, like the reason why I'm reviewing this is because I had fun watching it. And so maybe someone else will, and maybe they won't. So it's just the roll of the dice that it's kind of whatever I like savor the flavor of watching. So let's savor the flavor and spoil this movie. So the way this movie, in my mind, is to begin, because hopefully it probably won't go in the exact same way that this movie breaks out or breaks down. So the very beginning of this film, we have a grocery boy who is to deliver uh, groceries, of course, to a old lady who is to be Elizabeth. So this grocery boy is to just drop the grocery bags like at the woman's house and is calling for her. It's like, Miss Elizabeth, like, or Elizabeth, like I dropped your groceries out. Like, hey, yeah, like you don't have to pay me, you can pay me next time. But this kid continues to just go through this woman's house. Like, I don't know what he's hoping for, because this is kind of an old gal. Like, I don't know what he was expecting, like hoping to maybe like bust in on this girl like changing or something weird. I don't know. What was this kid's like, was he just trying to find the girl to just confirm that he dropped the groceries off? He could have just dropped this off and left. I don't know how many times a lot of people would like just drop stuff off and then leave, because that's what normally happens in a lot of places. So the grocery store kid goes in and finds an old lady just dangling by a hook. She's like swinging back and forth. And so this kid runs like the devil, is chasing him out of this house and gets onto his little motorcycle and motorcycles the heck out of here. And so the next thing that we are to see is to, of course, have Roger Cobb and like any bit of his family going to this funeral of his Aunt Elizabeth. So Roger Cobb is to eventually do a bunch of book signings, and so he is to meet some very interesting characters while doing this book signing. It seems like there's one gal that is to just be interested in Roger Cobb just because of his wife, that is to be some show star or whichever. And like there's also a bunch of other just kind of either creepy people or like whatever, but I guess that's what happens when you uh do a horror book. You'll get all kinds of people like coming out in the woodwork. Like you get some like punk rocker chick where Roger's like, hey, nice hair, and like you get all these like other people where Roger's like, where do you find these people? And like his publicist is like, they're your fans, so like you found them by writing this book. So after this book signing is over, we have Roger's publicist that is like, dude, you gotta write something new. Like, you gotta put something new out because, like, we can't do any more of these, like, autograph signings. Like, things are really starting to dry up. And one of Roger's fans is to ask him, like, hey, what are you doing next? And Roger's like, well, yeah, it's an autobiography of my time at Vietnam. And so the kid's like, well, that's great. I'm never gonna read that book. Why don't you do another horror film? Or why don't you do another horror book? Maybe you'll call it House. You'll describe your times at your freaking Aunt Elizabeth's house. Maybe you'll do that. So Roger is to eventually like go and have a good night's rest. But instead of legitimately having a good night's rest, he's having a nightmare about his son being grabbed by something coming from out of the ground. It's some like skeleton esh like hand. And so Roger is to immediately have nightmares that is to just drive him to take every single bit of his clothing, chuck it in some suitcase, and make his way to his Aunt Elizabeth's home. So Roger is to go into this house to, I guess, get solitude or silence or whatever. And Roger is to also get a call from his old flame, who is to be, I think, Sandy Sinclair, or maybe somebody else. Could be it. No, let's go with Sandy Sinclair. Um, because I think that is correct. So, yeah, I think that's actually correct. So, whoops. Well, that was a smart thing to do. Oh wait, we got it back, everybody. So anyways, Roger is getting a call from his old flame that obviously they had broken up because their son had gone missing. So that tore that relationship up. So Sandy is calling Roger to just kind of like check up on things. And so Roger is mentioning that he is going to write another book, and Sandy's like, "Great, you're gonna go and write another book. Good for you!" Like, and so Sandy had mentioned that she's like doing some award show, and like she had lost, and Roger's like, "Oh, well, that's too bad. Like who? It's a award show. Who cares?" It's not like you're getting any money out of that, but still, like, it's still good to be nominated because nominations will always get you further in your career. Like, you can ask for more money when eventually the season is to get renewed or whichever. Like I'm sure that can like catapult you into other things, but still. Anyways, like Roger, I think is like fake telling like Sandy that he's doing like some poker like game thing and he's like trying to like get back to that or like trying to put on like blaring music so that way like Sandy thinks that he's like having some party or is really busy, which he's not. Like he's not spending any time with anyone. So eventually we have Roger who is to hang up with Sandy. And so Roger is trying to like start this book, but he gets into little like chunks of it here and there. But at first, like he just like he can't get himself to start writing it. And so we eventually have Roger who's just like trying to find some like things to just kind of bide time. But eventually once he gets into miss into the home of that was before his aunts, we have Roger who's like getting a little piece here and there of his time in Vietnam, really setting up the character of Big Ben just kind of being this like douchebaggery like guy that is to like basically when Roger is to ask for a cigarette, we have Big Ben saying, "Here, like here's my thing to get a cigarette from," and so Roger opens it up and there's like a little snake in it, and he's like, like come on, Big Ben, like hey man, like that's what happens when you go asking for a man's cigarette, and so like we have their superior that is like giving him guff because the guy is consistently wanting to. I guess his name is uh, it's the lieutenant. The lieutenant is kind of giving people guff because like they're like trying to put something together. At some point, there's a grenade that is to go into their spot, and so like everybody's like, hey, everybody get down, there's a grenade, and so the grenade goes off. I don't think anyone dies, so but like that's that chunk of story that goes on there. Eventually I'm probably gonna like continue to like chomp at the bit for some of these stories, but also I'm gonna have to get to some of the bits and pieces of when this house starts to go amok or awry. So justifiably, we have Roger who is to come out of his house to just kind of do the garbage or do something. Eventually, I think at some point he's to see like some animals kind of rummaging through his trash, so on and so forth. Roger is to eventually bump into one of his neighbors, which I think is Tanya, and like Roger is to just be like, ooh, like Tanya, like jogging her way into my heart because she's so attractive. So Roger also is to bump into a guy named Harold, who I guess is to technically be a fan of Rogers because he has like bits and pieces of this guy's book, like all torn up into pages. And so Roger is like, well, hey, like, Harold, do you have a pen? And Harold is like, I don't. And so Roger is like, well, hey, like, if anything, I'd be happy to sign whatever this is later. But I want to go back to my house for solitude. And so basically, after that, Harold is taking the consistent solitude. Like, every single time, like, Roger is to mention something, Harold is like solitude. Like, yeah, I get it. Like we have Roger who is to consistently ask like or tell everyone that he like wants his own like space, solitude, whatever to write his book. And there's just people that just come in here anyways, and they're just like, well, like how about you do this for me because like I just feel like you'll just be a good person to just do this garbage for me. And then Roger's like okay, like I'll do this today, but I'm not gonna do it any other freaking day for you. Like no, sorry, not gonna happen. Um, Let me pause here for a second. All right, so now we are to cover some bizarre things that are to start popping off at this house. So Roger is to consistently open up this medicine cabinet, and every single time that you are to assume that this medicine cabinet is going to like get open, like immediately you're thinking like something is going to jump out of this medicine cabinet, or he's going to close the medicine cabinet and there's going to be something behind him that he sees in the reflection, because that's the normal thing to go with when you're to see a horror movie and you're like, they're going to do something with that medicine cabinet. Because I don't know how many times I've seen a medicine cabinet movie where you're going to get some kind of jump scare out of that. But anyways, so the very first thing that Roger is to see is his Aunt Elizabeth, and his Aunt Elizabeth is coming to him as a ghost to mention that this house will trick him. It tricked her, and it led her to eventually decide to hang herself. And you see her going back into her room, taking a rope to herself, and when she is to eventually jump off, all of a sudden the ghost is to disappear. Like, that's the real first ghostly sighting of like this house, but eventually there is to come and have more. So eventually there is a part in this movie where we are to have this like realtor who was going to put this home for a for sale sign. But Roger's like, you know what? I think I just want to stay here for a couple days and just kind of like, just maybe live here, maybe not live here. I don't know. I'm not sure. I just want to take a couple days to write my book. So Chet Parker is to come in and to kind of mention all the stuff that this guy could do with this home. Eventually having like a guest home that he used to make out of this like big shed looking thing. And like we just had this guy consistently coming in, like showcasing like how like this guy could improve this home if this is what he really wanted to do. Also, there's this big like sword fish, like the fish with like the big elongated like beak or whatever, or nose or whatever. Like I think it's a swordfish. So eventually it seems that uh that Roger's uncle was to be like this big wig fisher that I guess like this fish had been some record of fish being caught. And so Roger's like, yeah, my uncle, like just a fisherman, I guess. So kind of alluding that probably something will happen with that fish, but like we'll foreshadow that to eventually be later when I talk about that, probably fairly soon, because that comes up fairly early in this movie. So, so we had this guy named Chet who's just kind of going through this house, Chet Parker, and just kind of telling Roger about this home, but eventually, like, that guy eventually goes away, and Roger is to eventually just stay in this house. So, the next creepy thing that is to end up happening in this house, speaking of swordfish, so all of a sudden, Roger is to make his way like through the house, and all of a sudden this swordfish is starting to like wobble like off the thing that it's on, the plaque or whatever that it's resting on. All of a sudden is just it's unrest, and it's freaking wobbling like the fish that would like sing "Take me to the river, slap me in the ocean" or whatever the heck that it used to sing. Like that thing is going on with this fish bizarrely. And so Roger is to all of a sudden like start freaking out. And so all of a sudden he like grabs his shotgun and he like loads the weapon and he shoots the swordfish with his shotgun. But of course, like this like fish isn't going down. So Roger just tries to take this fish like off the wall and tries to just like put it and store it somewhere else, trying to just get rid of it and hope that it'll stop freaking moving, and eventually like it does. So that leads to one bizarrish moment that makes no sense to me. But it's weird, but it's cool, and it's like I knew something was probably gonna happen with that, but I was like, yeah, like that's cool. So also we have Roger who is to go ahead and decide because justifiably he is hearing sounds of his kid. Roger is just kind of like watching TV, just going like, meh, you know what? Like I'm not quite finding anything cool on. And so all of a sudden, Roger is to start seeing like reflections of his kid in the window or in parts of his house. Like he's starting to hear his son like talk or something in this house. And so Roger is to see like a reflection of his son in this window. And so bizarrely, like Roger is to turn that off as if it's like a TV thing via the window, and of course his son just like turns off. But Roger keeps hearing the sound of his son in some part of this house. So Roger decides that he's going to go after where that sound is, and that leads him to this closet. So Roger decides, oh, hey, let's see what happens when I'm in this robe, and I'm just going to open this closet. So all of a sudden, this big giant monster comes and starts slicing Roger's robe and starts scarring up this man's chest. And so Roger starts to like desperately like push this thing back into the closet because he's like, good God, man. Good God, how am I going to get this thing back in there? Because this thing is going to kill me and slice me up. But eventually Roger is to chuck this thing back into this closet and close the door and just be like, oh, thank God. Like, man, this thing was freaky. So all of a sudden we have Roger who is to just be like, okay, this will be the one thing that I can prove to everyone that I'm not losing my freaking mind. Because we have Harold who is to eventually call up Sandy, and because the more and more time that Harold is spending with Roger, like Harold is thinking like, dude, this guy's losing his freaking mind. So I'm gonna call over Sandy and just like kind of tell her that like, hey, do you think that you can go and spend some time with Roger? And Sandy's like, I don't know. Like, I have like show stuff to work on. Like, it's not like I can't just leave and just like I have like show things to do. I have a contract and obligations, and I just can't leave. So Harold is just like, well, okay, well, can I reach you somewhere? Like, just in case something does happen. So Sandy's like, sure. And so anyways, so eventually, because what ends up happening is that Roger is to go and have like a million different like photos and cameras and stuff, and to set this all up and time it all out to, and that's when he re-meets up with Harold. Like Roger has all this like military gear on, like as if he like kept it from being in Vietnam. And so Roger is now to go in and try to have like a little rope on this door and open the door up and quickly, and then run out of the room, run out of the house, and have supposedly all these cameras and videotape and all kinds of things like recording this event of this thing coming out of this closet. But when Roger is to leave the home, eventually with him going, yes, like I avoided this thing, all of a sudden Harold is like, what are you doing there, Roger? Like, are you like coming out of the house to get some more solitude? And so Roger is like, well, yeah, like I just wore all this stuff so I can like get back into your novel. Yeah, okay. Like I guess you had to just like be very meta about it, that you actually had to wear the gear that you were wearing in Vietnam, I guess. So, but eventually what ends up happening is that Roger is to start understanding that everything is to actually happen by midnight, and Roger did not open this door by midnight, and so that's the reason why the monster didn't come out at midnight, because he did it well beforehand. So Roger is starting to figure that out, that all the worst things happen at midnight. So he's like, oh, okay, so like now I can understand now when all the crazy crap happens. So the very next thing that is to happen is that I'm kind of wondering whether this happens at midnight or not. Like, I don't think everything perfectly aligns at that midnight time, because reasonably I think there's some stuff that does happen in the middle of the day. Like, I think there's some obvious things that I feel happens at the middle of the day instead of midnight. But anyways, let's get on to it. So the next thing that is to happen is that we are to eventually have uh, Roger eventually getting to more of his writing, to having us eventually find out that both Roger and Big Ben were going on their own, and eventually we had Big Ben who ended up getting shot down by, I guess, some Japanese people. And so Big Ben was telling Roger that he wants him to kill him because he doesn't want to be taken by Japanese people and tortured and whatever. And so Roger's like, well, like, I can't do that, Ben. Like, I can't kill you. Like, if anything, I'll go and I'll get some backup and, like, we'll get you out of here. And I think what ends up happening is Ben ends up getting retrieved by the Japanese and he ends up getting tortured and murdered and whatever. And so Roger could never go back to get to Big Ben and save him because stuff happens. So he got to that part of like writing and so on and so forth. So eventually we have Roger who is to have supposedly Sandy. Oh yeah, this has to be during the day. Yeah, this has to be completely during the day. So it can't be at midnight. So I guess that whole midnight thing is like kind of bonkers because there's obviously one scene that's done clearly during the day. Because yeah, so we'll get to that right now. So Roger is to see Sandy come back home to him in this home, and she's wearing this like really nice dress and everything like that. And so Roger is to have his like shotgun at hand because really all kinds of craziness is going on in this house. And so all of a sudden Sandy is to go and supposedly pick up something, and then she is to reemerge as a completely different person because this thing is to be a witch. This giant, ugly looking witch thing. And so, of course, we have Roger who is to try to take this thing out, who's tried to fight it and so on and so forth, to eventually end up uh like seeing this thing like disappear. And so eventually Roger is to decide to open up the closet room again. He goes back into the closet room to try to open this thing up, and all of a sudden the witch is behind him and smacks him on the back of the head with the shotgun, which eventually just leads Roger to eventually just start beating the crap out of this thing again, this witch thing, and eventually just starts deciding to chop this thing up. Because what ends up happening is that Roger is to eventually open this door to where all of these gardening shears and stuff start coming at this witch and start attacking her and cutting her. Because at one point in this movie, we all of a sudden have these like gardening shear like things that are just coming out of the woodwork and just attacking almost Roger at some point. And so he dodges most of them. And but anyways, so the witch is to get her like head cut off and like pieces cut off, arms and stuff cut off. So Roger goes on and tries to bury this witch. And while he's doing that, he coincidentally finds that Tanya has just commandeered his pool. Like, like my neighbor's just coming in and just using my pool without my permission? Like, you can't just knock? Like, I don't care that, like, that Tanya, like, like used to be with Aunt Elizabeth, and like Aunt Elizabeth would just say, anytime you want to come on in. Like, I think really, like, this whole part was to butter Roger up even more. To just be like, hey, yeah, you want to see me in my bathing suit? So whatever I ask you to do, you'll just go, too, right? So Tanya is to come out of the pool and almost give us that, like, Fast Time of Richmond High. But like she's not just gonna like reveal anything to us, which sucks, but it is what it is. So Tanya is to like basically ask Roger like, "Hey, like are you planting something, some saplings or whatever?" And Roger's like, "Yeah, if a witch is saplings, then sure." Like he doesn't tell her that, but like I feel like that's what he should have told her. So this witch's arm is consistently trying to grab for Roger or to grab for Tanya. And so Roger is to consistently try and like have this hand and like crush it under his foot. But eventually this witch keeps going after like Tanya or both Roger's like legs. So he just like crushes it into the ground, eventually trying to push Tanya off because he's like, you know what, I have like so much planting I need to do. I really need to get to that right away. And so Tanya runs off, and so like Roger just keeps smacking this thing with a shovel repetitiously, hoping it dies finally. And so like Roger is to try to chop this thing into little itty bitty pieces so he can eventually just plant all of it. But eventually there's a dog that ends up like digging up the hand part, and eventually that will end up having this hand making its way back into this home. Tanya is to mention uh that maybe she should put something together for Roger to play. And like it seems like that is kind of left to be very cryptically misunderstood, that maybe Roger is thinking that maybe play meaning Roger and Tanya are gonna get together and like do some kind of like game, or maybe doing something a little bit more fun, if you know what I mean. But so what ends up actually happening is Tanya just decides to just dump her kid off at Roger's home. That is the worst possible thing that Tanya could do. Do not dump this kid off at this guy's home, because we are getting into flashback territory here. And let's get to another part of this movie. So we are to eventually find Roger's kid, who had basically vanished from this home. Because what ends up happening is that Roger and his son were playing in the backyard. Like Roger, I think, was like doing some kind of uh, like digging or something, and like Roger's son was just kind of playing with like action figures or something in the backyard. And so all of a sudden, like his son had vanished, and so Roger goes back in to ask Sandy. It's like, "Hey, did you see our son somewhere?" Like Roger is to eventually look at the very front of the house and see that there's a car that bizarrely is driving way too fast, like driving off. But Roger doesn't think anything of it. So Roger is starting to like look through the house, and then Roger is starting to look back into the backyard, eventually seeing his son in the pool, and so Roger like dives after his son, and then all of a sudden like the son is not in this pool, the son is just gone. And so Roger's like, I am so confused. So eventually Roger is like just kind of toweling off, like talking to these policemen about his like son just being gone, and like he just got like sucked up from this pool or something, because like Roger dove after him and his son just vanished bizarrely. So really there was like nothing that they could find to figure out where this kid was, and nobody really understood what the heck was going on. So I guess that's just led to just Sandy and Roger just deciding to just like go their separate ways because Roger lost their kid. So now Roger is to have Tanya's son. And how is this going to end up badly? Because this kid is to basically just spend the night over at Roger's house. So that means after midnight. So, like, don't feed the gremlins after midnight, but also, like, don't leave another kid in this home after midnight. So, man, is this gonna suck. So, Roger is trying to one, when Tanya's kid is to immediately come to this home, we have the witch's hand that appears onto Tanya's son's back. And so now, like, Roger is desperately trying to get back and find this kid and take this hand from off of this kid and eventually, like, trying to flush this hand down the toilet. And then, uh, Roger brings Tanya's kid back to him after supposedly Roger just says, "Oh yeah, like the kid just needed to go to the bathroom and I helped him out with that." Tanya's like, "Oh wow, you're doing great already," and Roger's like, "Oh, just you wait, just I'll have this kid being like terrified for the rest of his life." But I guess that's your fault for bringing him here because you're a horrible parent. You don't know what's going on in this house. How about you spend a night with me and you'll figure that frickin' out? So. But you won't because you don't think I'm like good enough of that kind of guy to like get a date or two out of me. No, you just want to use me to babysit so that way you can go off to a party somewhere, I'm sure. So uh so Tanya leaves, and so Roger is just trying to like be the best he can with this kid. Like, but really he's hoping that this kid just falls asleep. Cuz Roger is trying to get to his book and trying to write a chunk of that, and that's when he's writing about the Big Ben stuff. And so all of a sudden like the kid is to like be restless and start moving around a lot. And so Roger is like trying to keep him on one spot, like trying to keep him like interested in like, hey, like let's watch TV, and the kid's like, okay, sure. But then immediately once the kid is watching this TV, he's like, I'm not interested in this. Like I'm gonna go and play with my action figures and then maybe fall asleep. So Roger is like, okay, kid, just please just fall asleep. Like fall asleep so I won't have to like take care of you. While also having to figure out what the heck is gonna happen with this house tonight. So the kid is to fall asleep, but eventually we are to find that this kid will eventually not be the only small thing roaming around this house. So all of a sudden, we are to eventually start seeing that that Roger is getting his kid a little carried away, let's just say. All of a sudden Roger is to see that this kid is to be taken by these things called little critters. And so Roger is to go and follow where like these little critters are taking this kid. And so Roger is seeing that they're like taking him up some like roof chimney, not a roof, a chimney. And so because eventually like Roger is to find where the heck that these things are going with this kid. And so eventually he sees like one of the critters just going like, hey, and then he closes the door. And so Roger goes in there and like takes this kid as these critters are like taking this Roger up through this chimney. And so Roger like gets this kid away from these little critters, and so these little critters just go away. Like after that, I guess they're just like, well, I guess we lost, so like we're just gonna not have enough time to get this kid. So Roger just puts this kid in a bath, and so the kid just slaps him with a sponge, and so Roger just kind of like just takes the sponge, is like, whatever, kid. Like this is all. This hopefully is almost over for us. Like, anyways, hopefully Tanya will be back any minute now, and so Roger just gets the kid back into pajamas, and so like Tanya is to eventually come and pick up the kid, and Roger is like, "Oh, thank God." Luckily, this kid is not gone. Luckily, this kid is not sucked into anywhere because, good God. So Tanya retrieves the kid, and so like Roger is to make up something where it's like, yeah, like this kid was great. Like this kid was like a lot of fun, and I hope I never have to do this again. Go and have your other neighbors go ahead and take care of this kid. I'd appreciate it. So, like, I wish that's what Roger would have said, but he like said so many nice things and whatever. Just I think for brownie points' sake to win over this woman. So, anyways, eventually Harold is to go out of his way to spend more time with Roger, because if Harold isn't thinking that this guy's a loon, I guess he just wants to spend more time with him so that way he can get more papers autographed, so that way he can get like more things to sell to people, probably on eBay at some point in the future. So Harold is to make his way over to Roger's house and like bring some like snacks and food and stuff. And so Roger brings him over to a certain part of the house where it seems like nothing really happens. And so then eventually Roger is to tell Harold about the closet that has a lot of the gear in it, because eventually Harold was to see the room that had a lot of the cameras and stuff like that, and he questioned him about it. And Harold is just like, well, that's because I thought I saw some rodent of some kind. And Harold was like, oh, some rodent. Oh, okay. Like some unusual sized rodent. But then eventually Roger comes clean and he's like, oh no, like actually what I said was an actual rodent was actually a ghost of some kind, a monster. And I want to prove it to you by like opening up this closet door at a specific time. And like, man, you gonna see this thing. And so Harold is to go with Roger to go up into this spot. And so Roger is just giving Harold a harpoon gun. And I'm just like, what a flimsy weapon to give this guy. Like, it's gonna be a one-shot thing, and then like you might as well give him a shotgun or something. You might as well give him something that's gonna be quite possibly more effective. So really, Roger is building up this like to Harold. It's like, yeah, like be prepared. Like freaking Roger's having like a mattress in front of him and like bringing like all kinds of things like to just be prepared. And so the more and more that Roger is building this up, the more and more scared that Roger is, to where like it seemed like Roger was a very like Harold was a very confident guy, but then eventually once this seems like, why is Roger being so scared about all of this? That's what kind of got Harold kind of scared. So eventually that leads to Roger opening up this door and then Harold freaking the F out. And like Roger is like fighting this thing off with this poker, and so like Roger's telling Harold like, hey man, like shoot it with the harpoon gun. And so Harold is just shoot it with the harpoon gun, and like this is like a one-off weapon where reasonably like Roger cannot do much after this, or and neither can Harold. And so Roger is to almost get sucked into this closet with this monster. And so Harold is to grab onto Roger, and he's like, hey, like, if this is the last thing I do, like, I'm gonna hold on to you, Roger. And eventually, like, Harold has his hand slip, and, like, Roger almost gets, like, sucked into this whole, like, closet thing. And, so, what ends up eventually happening is that Roger is to come back to Harold, and eventually that is to lead like I think also like I think what ends up happening is that Roger ends up having flashbacks. Yeah, that is probably what happens. Like I think I don't know how many times that I like go into like thinking where the Big Ben situation has like happens. Like and I think it's probably actually here. Yeah. Because I think the time before is like there was another scenario where like I said that like oh that's the Big Ben situation. Maybe that's some other flashback uh of Roger in Vietnam. Or that was like basically nothing. Like he started some kind of memory, but it didn't really go anywhere. So like here now is the Big Ben situation that I mentioned that eventually uh, Roger was supposed to kill Big Ben, but eventually Big Ben got like captured by the Vietnamese forces, and like so eventually Roger is to I think come out of the pool, and so eventually like Roger is to confirm with Harold like all the stuff that had happened that like hey man like like we fought this thing, and so that just leaves Harold to just finally believe in what Roger is saying that all this whole place is haunted and whatever. So uh like Harold goes on to get so blitzed and so drunk that eventually Roger is now having to drop Harold onto some couch because like he just got blackout drunk because he's like, dude, I am just like I can't believe what I just saw kind of thing. So that just leads to have Roger eventually to as he has numerous times in this movie open and close his like medicine cabinet eventually to look at some kind of medications and stuff like that and like think about taking them but he doesn't take them. So Roger eventually now decides that when he is to close his medicine cabinet he is to go and chuck some uh like stool of sorts into this medicine cabinet via like the mirror. And so when Roger is to do that, all of a sudden, he is to kind of like poke his head through this spot and to just kind of see, like, hey, what's in here? Like, how far can I fall down here? Because Roger goes and chucks like something in through the spot to see, like, if there's going to be a sound that happens anytime soon, and nothing does make a sound. So all of a sudden, Roger is to all of a sudden get sucked into this like medicine cabinet, and like there's all these like monsters and hands. It's like the Sigourney Weaver like Ghostbusters moment, where all of a sudden like all these like freaking monster hands are like coming from out of her like chair in her home and try to like suck her into like there is no Dana only Zool moment. So all of a sudden Roger has like all these monsterish hands like grabbing onto him, trying to pull him in there, all kinds of stuff. And so Roger is then deciding like, well, that sounded like a cool adventure. I need some more of that. Roger has decided, you know what, maybe if I go in here, maybe I will find my son. So I need to go in here and like see if I can find my son through all of this. So Roger goes and like takes a rope and drops it into this thing, and then just decides, oh, I'm just gonna go ahead and just, just go and try to see what happens when I consistently go through this spot with this rope. And so Roger is to eventually go and find his kid through all this madness, because we find that Roger's kid looks like he's some like POW like person that has been like locked in this cage for a long stretch of time. And so Roger rescues his kid, and so Roger's kid is to mention that, like, hey, like, we need to get out of here quick because, like, the monster is going to come, or the guy is going to come. And so Roger's like, well, okay, then let's get the heck out of here. So eventually both Roger and his kid, like, try to go so far out of this, this bizarre-ish, like, flashback slash monster world of his, that leads to both of them all of a sudden back coming from out of the pool. And so they're like, oh my god, like, we did it together, like, we survived this. And so both of them get out of the pool, and like Roger is so relieved to have his son back. So, but like, this is a whole movie set up to have Roger face like all of his fears, and eventually, like, there are some people that could not face their fears because they were too old, like Aunt Elizabeth was. But Roger is now like the young buck, so now he has to like face his fear and become a much stronger person and much more of a confident person. Like, I think Roger has had a lot of fear about writing his book out, and so I think reasonably, because a lot of like there's a hesitation of reading or writing the book because like Vietnam things might just not be like a real cool thing to talk about. Everyone has talked about Vietnam. Like, it's really just the fact that maybe Roger needs to go and write another horror book because that's what people like. So, and that feels obvious from one of his fans asking, hey, what are you going to do next? Oh, I'm going to write about Vietnam. And they're like, yeah, I could care less about that. So, pushing on. So, to finish this up. So, Roger is to go and think that everything is done. They're going to head out their front door to realize that there is a person that is to be on that front door. And that, of course, is to be a skeleton Big Ben. And, like, I think when I had seen this in a very long time or a long spot, like, I think that was kind of like, I should have expected something coming out of that, but, like, that was also, like, a scary moment for me. Like, I think this movie was, like, pretty scary, especially if you watch this for the first time. It is a pretty scary thing because you're kind of, there's a lot to be unexpected about this movie. But I think after a couple watches, you're like, oh, okay, I remember this spot. Oh, okay, I remember this happening. So, eventually, the skeleton Big Ben is to eventually try to terrify Roger. And so we have it where both Roger and his son are just kind of like running through this house while skeleton Big Ben is like coming after him. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get you. Yeah, it's gonna happen. So we have where reasonably this leads to them kind of like Big Ben is like chasing them throughout the entire house to the point where eventually like Roger is just deciding, you know what, like, I am just going to finally just face my fear. Like, I am just going to face like Big Ben and just start like beating the crap out of him. So like, really, just Roger just decides, like, you know what, I'm not going to take this anymore. And so Roger just, like, rips freaking Big Ben's, like, arm off and starts beating him with it. Just like, no, I'm not going to take this anymore. I'm just going to start beating you with your own arm until eventually Ben goes and, like, is like, yeah, like, your grandmother could have hit me harder. And so, like, Ben grabs his arm back and puts his arm back into the spot that it is. And so but eventually, like, Roger is just adamantly just like, I will not, like, I'm not going to take this. Like, I'm going to consistently just keep fighting off this thing because I've fought in so many monsters already. And so this is just one of another, like, monster that I faced. So eventually, like, Roger is to get the best of this Big Ben, and like we are to naturally assume that, like, oh, okay, like he's like he beat this thing, he's fought this thing, and he beat him, and so all of a sudden, uh, Roger is to naturally assume that he beat Big Ben in some way or another, and all of a sudden, Big Ben is to be grabbing on to Roger's son and be like, yeah, like I have your son, like, yeah, it sucks to be you. And Roger's like, you know what, I've beaten you, like, you're done, like, I'm sick of you. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take one of your grenades and just like take you and freaking shove this grenade into your rib cage and walk off with my son. Cause like I've beaten you already. Like I've done enough to take you down. Like I like have apologized for like leaving you there, but if you're gonna haunt me for the rest of my life, fine. But like reasonably, this is over. Like your haunting days are numbered. This house is done. Like I am done taking this house's crap. So the skeleton Big Ben is to supposedly explode, basically meaning that like the Big Ben is to basically no longer exist, and Rogers to have the confidence enough to not have to deal with this house anymore. So that just leaves both Roger and his son just leaving this home. All of a sudden, coincidentally, Sandy is to make her way via taxi to make it back to this home to notice that Roger and their son is out of this house. And so all of a sudden, both Sandy and her son had hugged. And so that is just the end of this movie. And so, like, yeah, I try to like skirt around or I try to like just finish up this movie. So there's some details that people were desperately wanting. Uh, but yeah, like I wish that this could have like ended in an even better way to where all of a sudden we were to see like bookshelves of the movie House being put together. Like I thought that would have been cool, like of an ending, but it just didn't go that way. It just wasn't in the cards. So with that said, I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Bye, everybody.